Can
you take down the slide, please?
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Warm greetings on a cold winter morning from Houston, Texas. To all of you in the US, in India, and everywhere else. My name is Hiren Sarma, and it's my privilege to coordinate this webinar session on behalf of Foundation for India Studies, FIS. And it's on a very important subject of scientific mind. Can I see the agenda, please? Second slide. Second one. Here is today's business. Welcoming all of you. And Mr. Krishnaji is going to introduce FIS. I will introduce the speaker. There will be the presentation, and then it will be followed by question and answer. Can you take the slide off, please?
Yes, the slide is off.
Okay. And why you are coming in? Okay, at the onset, I would like to thank all the participants for joining this session, and I can promise you that it will be an interesting one. A big thanks to Mr. Prakash Shesh for agreeing to take up this session with us. And from FIS, I would like to convey my thanks to Mr. Sudhakar Talavajulla and Mr. Chandra Bhavilala, without whose support we would not have reached at this point. Now, of course, I would like to invite our illustrious founder, chairman, and I would call it the heart and soul of FIS, Mr. Krishna Bhavilala, to briefly introduce FIS to the participants. Krishna ji, please.
Thank you, Hiren. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All of you? Okay. Thank you for the nice introduction. And Foundation for India Studies is, it was established in 2005, which is quite a long time ago, right? And since then, we had made considerable progress. And the very concept for having this foundation is to dispel ignorance about India in North America and also connect Indian culture to local communities here. And for the benefit of our viewers, I would go over the activities and achievements of the Foundation for India Studies briefly. The primary purpose, as I explained, is already to promote greater understanding of India and in the mainstream America. At present, the Foundation manages 4 different and diverse projects, namely the India Studies programs and recording of Indo-American oral histories and preserve them for future generations. And then the third one is presenting the distinguished lectures on various topics. And today's event is one of them. So far, we had presented 20 speakers over 15 years period. And we are fortunate to have Prakash Ji today with us. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we had to resort to the webinar situation. Thank you, Prakash Ji, for taking time to speak on our platform. And these are not the only projects. We also connect with the local communities at the grassroots level under our outreach programs. As I already mentioned, the India Studies program, it was established in 2006 at the University of Houston. We were the promoters and initiators for the project. Then 10 years ago, we took up another project called the Indo-American Oral History Project. And that is to preserve the life stories of the first generation Indian immigrants who came over to America and settled in Houston. The Houston Chronicle ran a feature article with a headline, Houston's Indians writing their own history. That was quite a recognition. That being the signature project, we were also recognized by the Texas Oral History Association called TOHA. They awarded the Foundation for India Studies with the Mary Fay Bornes Award of Excellence last September in San Antonio in their 10th annual convention. We are very proud of that achievement. And we are also fortunate to have had NASA astronaut Sunita Williams come and speak about her Indian roots and heritage under our distinguished lecture series. As I said, last but not the least, our community outreach activities include partnering with other nonprofit organizations in Houston. And we have signed MOUs and agreements of cooperation with Houston Public Library, Houston Community College, Baylor University, and South Asian American Digital Archives of Pennsylvania. Some of our programs have also received partial funding from the Houston Humanities of Texas in Austin. And next, on January 18th, 2022, we will pay homage to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a follower of Mahatma Gandhi ji. And this is our 10th year in a row we are participating. And Mr. Sudhakar is the event chair for that. And for further details, you may go to our, you may check our website on www Foundation for India Studies and registration. And I thank you all for joining us today in this program. But before I let you go, I want to show you our achievements, just trophy. For example, this particular is the Community Service Award for the organization given by the India Culture Center in 2012. And behind me is, I can show you, this is the trophy we received from the MLK Grand Parade organization as this is called the Grand Marshal Award for our participation in the parade. Like that, we did receive several honors and recognitions over the past 20 years. So we are very proud of our achievements in a small way. And thank you all again for joining us today's webinar on the Developing the Scientific Temper, given by our distinguished speaker, Mr. Prakash Sheshji, and speaking live from India. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating.
Thank you, Krishnaji. I'm sure you would love to go for a whole day about FIS, but given the time constraint, Prakash, can you, I don't know why when I speak, the screen is supposed to come in, right?
Yes, and we are able to see you.
You can see, okay. I don't see it here. Oh, probably, yes. Okay.
It is a field mission.
All right. Now, thanks again to Mr. Krishnaji. Before I introduce our speaker, Prakash Shesh, I would like to remind you for a couple of housekeeping. Can I get the third slide, please? Yeah, as you have noted, we have kept all the participants' videos and audios in mute condition. What you can do, if you want to see the speaker on the screen, you can go to the top. There is an icon called view. If you click there, if you put a speaker, then you will be seeing the speaker on view. Then participants are requested, just be clear about this, please. When you listen to Mr. Prakashji, put your question in the chat box, which is at bottom of the screen, and put your name, your location, and the question. And I will be moderating it. So I will read the questions and your name and the location for Mr. Prakash to answer. Thank you very much. Just one more thing, when you write the chat, you might have 2-3 different options. The normal option is everybody. So please write the message and click at everybody and it will come to us. Thank you. Can you please take the screen down? Now, here is the main objective of the day. Let us welcome Mr. Prakash Shesh from Nagpur, India. Mr. Shesh is a very well-known management consultant in corporate India. He holds a master's degree in physics from IIT Delhi. I'm from Assam, by the way. So Guwahati comes to my head first. I'm sorry. IIT Delhi. And he holds an MBA from prestigious IIM Ahmedabad. He has published more than 350 articles and conducted more than 700 management seminars for a number of major corporations in India. He is also a regular TED speaker and was a former governor of Rotary International India. He is the author of a best-selling book, In and Out of the Box. So you can see many facets, but one least known factor about Mr. Shesh, at least in my world here, is that he is a prolific singer of golden oldies of Bombay cinema. And that could be another session, I would say. Now, here I'm proud to welcome Mr. Prakash Shesh. Prakashji, please.
Well, thank you, Hiren, for that wonderful introduction. And I hope all of you are able to hear my voice loud and clear.
Can you make it slightly louder, please, if it can?
Okay. Okay, is it better now?
Slightly more if you can.
Okay, slightly more.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, okay. I'll also speak a little louder and I hope everyone's able to hear it. Now, I must start with a hearty namaskar to all of you. I like this greeting namaskar because it is so time neutral. See, it's nearing midnight here in India and it's early morning for you there in the US. And I can still say namaskar without, a lot of worry. Namaskar, as all of you know, means that I bow down to the sacredness inside you. So it's a very cross-cultural kind of a greeting. And I am always worried about good morning or good afternoon, basically, because when I say good morning to you, and if you ask me saying, do you have the power to make my morning good? I will have to answer that in the negative. So that's why I've chosen this greeting of Namaskar. And of course, in today's pandemic days, it's a very contactless kind of a greeting. You must have realized that I have started on a very analytical note, spending a full minute and a half maybe on just the word Namaskar. But that is to build up, the atmosphere, because today's session on developing scientific temper is going to be fairly analytical. So I thought, let me start off on that note. Another reason why I'm not using a PowerPoint presentation, which I normally do in many of my webinars, but I'm not using my PowerPoint presentation today because I don't think this is a training session. And I like, people to see my face, maybe see the expressions on my face. Otherwise, what happens is, that when you in a Zoom surrounding make it into a PowerPoint presentation, you are reduced to a small window towards the right. And I don't like that. So that is why I'm not going to use a PowerPoint presentation today. Are you all able to hear me properly, or is there some modification which needs to be made? Hiren, can you answer that?
Yeah, some people are probably hearing little louder, depending. So maybe make it a one notch lesser.
One notch lesser, okay. No, I can make it one notch lesser by, speaking a little less louder, because
okay.
Yeah, I'm augmenting the computer system with my own volume.
It's good now.
Okay. Scientific temper is a term which many of you would be surprised has its origins. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister of India, is credited with discovering this term in his book, The Discovery of India. In fact, many prime ministers of the country of India have coined various slogans. Lal Bahadur Shastri, for example, if you remember, coined the slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. Jawan is a soldier, Kisan, of course, is a farmer. Then Atal Bihari Vajpayee added to that, and he added Jai Vigyan to that, which means may victory be to science. And then Narendra Modi recently, about 2-3 years ago, added Jai Anusandhan, which means doing research, or may the research ideology get set into our mind. You might also like to know that the Indian Constitution, and I think this is probably a unique nature of the Indian Constitution, that under Article 51A bracket H, we actually have the mention of developing scientific temper as a constitutional duty of Indians. Now, I searched a lot and I found that there isn't a parallel in any other country, in any other country's constitution, but I may be wrong. I'm willing to be corrected. What does scientific temper mean? It encourages humanism. I mean, these are the words used in the Constitution of India. It encourages developing scientific temper, as I have said, humanism, spirit of inquiry, and reform. So these are the exact words which are mentioned in the Constitution of India. So in a way, an Indian can demonstrate patriotism. He can exhibit patriotism by developing scientific temper inside himself. I mean, I am reminded, I conduct many interviews, and many a times I ask this question to the interviewee, saying that, are you patriotic? And obviously the answer is yes. I mean, nobody would answer a no to that question. And then I ask them, saying that, can you give me an instance or an example where you exhibited patriotism towards your country? And that stumps them. Most of them hee-haw, and then finally, the most common answer, at least amongst the younger people that I get, which I'm sure will bring a smile to your face too, they say that, many of you might know that in India, when you go to see a movie, you see the national anthem being played before the main movie. And they said, we demonstrate patriotism by standing up and stopping eating popcorn. That's the level of patriotism they think is high enough to be, commended by others. But here is another, I would say, a good, easy, and a sensible way of exhibiting patriotism towards your country, and that is developing scientific temper. So all Indians should, consider this to be as their constitutional duty. Many people feel that scientific temper is the heading of a chapter of science in a science textbook. Obviously, this is not so. It is an attitude and a way of life, as we'll realize as we go along. So to summarize, if we can well define scientific temper or developing scientific temper, this would be a good definition. You welcome new knowledge, even if it is against your long cherished beliefs, and you are committed to logical and rational thinking. This actually summarizes what we mean by scientific temper. And let's see how we try to develop this. Now, let me spend just a minute in explaining to you how I have structured this talk, apart from this introduction that I have just mentioned. We are going to tackle two questions in few minutes. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but the first question is that, are educated people, especially students of science, likely to have better scientific temper than people who are uneducated or who are not students of science? I mean, this is something which confounds many people because of the word science in this term of scientific temper. And the second question that we'll briefly touch upon is, how does science operate? I mean, is it some kind of a new way that we need to understand how science operates in general all across the world before understanding how we ourselves develop scientific temper? Or is it something which we already know? So we are going to tackle these two questions maybe initially. This will be followed by my sharing with you 5 zero-cost strategies to develop scientific temper. Just give me a minute. I am feeling a little warm, so I'm going to take out my jacket. These are zero-cost strategies because I have realized in my experience that Indians just love zero-cost methods. I mean, I'm going to leave no excuse for anyone not to follow what I am about to share with them. And this will then be followed with a question and answer session about which Hiren mentioned a few minutes ago. Okay. Let's get into the first question. Are students of science, or are those who are more educated, likely to have a better scientific temper than those who are not? This is the first question we said we'll discuss a little bit. Now, you've all heard of ISRO, ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization. It's probably a single largest collection of very highly educated people. People have PhDs in aeronautical engineering and missile technology and whatnot. I mean, their average level of education is very, very high as compared to you and me. And one of my colleagues from IIM Ahmedabad, he's dead now, Bala Subramaniam was his name. He worked in ISRO for many years, in fact, the whole of his life. Even after graduating from the IIM, he went back to ISRO. And he shared a secret with me, which later on was published in leading newspapers also. And that is that before every space launch, before the launch of any space vehicle, all the prototypes of those space vehicles are sent to Tirupati Balaji temple for worship for about a month. I mean, this is obviously for good luck, to bring good luck so that the space mission is successful. Now imagine if those PhDs and highly educated people, if they can resort to such methods, then who are you and I? I've got some other examples also. You've all heard of NASA, of course, being in America, you know what NASA is. Before cosmonauts are put into space, I believe a holy cross is slapped on their cheeks, lightly, of course, for good luck. You'll be surprised that people who are, those astronauts who are transported from their hotels to the launching site, they all, after they get down from the bus in which they are transported, they urinate on the back right wheel of that bus for good luck. They all are made to see a movie which was produced in 1969, once again for good luck, before takeoff, of course. So this is not unique to India or another highly educated country like USA. So apparently the conclusion is that having science education and being very educated does not necessarily give you a high index of scientific temper, as these examples would show us. Let's go to the second question. So when we conclude this, I would like to assure you that you need not be a student of science in order to, take benefit of whatever I'm going to share with you today. Even if you are a BA in history or a master's in history, what I'm going to say equally applies to you as it does to students of science. How does science operate? That was the second question I wanted to quickly touch upon before we go to those 5 zero-cost strategies. I'm sure you are very interested in those 5 zero-cost strategies. How does science operate? Science has a very simple way of operation, and it's called the scientific way of operation. But I'm sure, as I said, it can be implemented by anyone who's not a student of science also. This is the method by which science operates. It first questions some things. Like, for example, you imagine 1,000 years ago, or maybe 2,000 years ago, people did not know that the earth was rotating around itself, that it was rotating around the sun. So they did not know why there was day and night every day. But they observed it every day. And they started questioning the event, saying that when I get out of my house or hut or whatever, the sun seems to be rising from the same direction always. When I turn to the right, that's where the sun rises from. So you first question, After questioning, you observe, and obviously you realize that yes, indeed the sun rises from the right direction when I step out of my house, or the left, or whatever. After observing, you hypothesize. Hypothesize means you create a hypothesis, precisely of the nature that I am talking about. That if I step out of my house and turn to the right, that's where the sun rises from. And then if I step out of the house and turn to the left, that's where the sun sets. So this is a hypothesis. I don't know why it happens, but it's a hypothesis. I'm talking of 2000 years ago. After hypothesizing, you generate what are known as testable predictions. I mean, you generate some predictions, and then these are testable predictions. I mean, you can't just generate a philosophical prediction which cannot be tested. So you need to test that. After testing it, you get results, you analyze those results. So the next step is analysis. And after analysis, you probably come to a theory. And after you get a theory, then you communicate that theory to everyone so that they can also check your theory. So I'm repeating, this is traditionally known as the method which science operates with. Question, observe, hypothesize, generate testable predictions, analyze, theorize, that means create a theory, and then communicate. So this, in brief, is how science operates. And therefore, when we say we are going to develop scientific temper, we are going to stick to this method, or we are going to see if we could stick to this method in most of the things that we do in life. Okay, so we have these two things discussed a little bit. Let's straight away get into those 5 strategies that I'm going to share with you. Strategy number 1. It is clear that you cannot develop scientific temper unless you increase your curiosity. Now, curiosity for our purpose, I mean, somebody may say, I go to school every day, I go to college every day, so I get new knowledge every day. So am I not being curious? My answer to that is no. You are doing it with a purpose in mind. You want to pass that examination, you want to get that job, etc. The definition of curiosity, as far as our talk is concerned, is the ability of a person to attempt hundreds of questions that surround him, but, and this is important, without expecting any benefit from it. So if you get into the practice of answering questions or seeking answers to questions without expecting any benefits, then I would attribute it to your curiosity. You know, psychologists have long been saying that IQ, that means intelligence quotient, is not sufficient for a man to succeed in life. You need emotional quotient or emotional intelligence. Then somebody came and said, you also need spiritual quotient. According to me, these 3, of course, are important. But what is even more important is curiosity quotient. I mean, I've coined that term myself. You might not get it in a psychology textbook. So unless your curiosity quotient is high, it is unlikely that you will be high on the index of scientific temper. So you must, as a personality, develop this habit of seeking answers to hundreds and thousands of questions on various issues that surround you, but without expecting any benefit from it. These days, our societies have become so, I would say, money-oriented, syllabus-oriented, incentives-oriented, that we generally try to answer questions. And I mean, we try to answer questions only if they give us some benefit. And according to me, that does not fall in my definition of curiosity. Now, in a situation like this, it is a little difficult to, assess somebody's curiosity. But I'm going to ask you a few questions. I'm also going to give you the answers because I have realized that whenever I don't give the answers, people go back, slightly demotivated and depressed. And it's not my objective to, put people into a depression. But I'm just warning you that not knowing the answers to some of these questions that I'm now going to pose in front of you is likely to put you into a small amount of depression. Because these questions are not from any academic syllabus. So you might be a PhD, you might never have tried to answer this question. But they are questions of the type that should have been answerable by you at this stage of life. All of us are adults. Okay, so I'm going to ask you some questions in order to let you self-assess. In a Zoom situation, I can't do much more than that. In order to let you self-assess how good or bad your curiosity quotient is, because this would be the first step towards developing scientific temper. Okay, my first question is, most of us have gone to the temples. Why do we do pradakshina in a temple? Why do we go around the idol? In fact, we've been taught right from childhood that without doing a parikrama or a pradakshina, one must not go out of the temple, come out of the temple. And we religiously do it. But have we ever asked our elders or anyone else about why is it necessary to do this and what exactly am I going to achieve? And it's acceptable. A religious answer is also acceptable because this is a religious procedure. So a religious answer is okay. My survey says that about 90% of the people who do pradakshina in a temple do not know why they are doing it. Imagine that. Doing things without knowing and without trying to find out. Why? Because they bring no harm to you. And you all expect that if at all any benefits are going to accrue to me, I mean, if at all anything is going to accrue to me, it's going to be something good, some benefits. And I've found that even seniors in the family find it difficult to answer this question because they never questioned it when they were younger. And their seniors probably never explained to them why pradakshina is necessary. What is the purpose behind doing a pradakshina? Let me give you the answer. As I said, if I don't give the answer, it would be a little unfair. But I'll give very brief answers. You'll be surprised to know, or you may be happy to know, that pradakshina is basically a sin cancellation procedure recommended by Hinduism. I'm giving you examples from Hinduism because that's the religion I belong to. It's a sin cancellation procedure. For every step that you take while doing pradakshina, you are supposed to ask God to forgive one sin of yours. So I keep joking with a friend of mine who keeps telling me that I never come out of a temple unless I do 11 pradakshinas. And I said, you must be a Mahapapi in that case. 11 pradakshina, and I don't know how big that pradakshina is, but you are probably unknowingly, unwittingly asking God to forgive hundreds of your sins, which means you are a Mahapapi. Now, he doesn't understand the meaning of what I am saying. And I don't blame him because hardly anyone understands why they are doing pradakshina. Let's go to question number 2. Now, in the Indian culture, blowing off a burning candle is supposed to be very inauspicious. So inauspicious and so pakka is the association of this event with something bad happening, that if you go to see a Hindi film and if you have maybe a 2-3-year-old child with you, and in the film you suddenly see that a gust of wind blows off that earthen lamp and the flame extinguishes. Even that 3-year-old child will now tell his parent, saying that, Mommy, the heroine's father who is in the hospital is now going to die. Imagine, so fast is the association, or so strong is the association between the lamp getting blown off and something bad happened. And in spite of this, why do almost 100% of Hindu households or Indian households, let me put it that way, why do they blow off burning candles on a birthday? I mean, birthday is surely a very auspicious occasion. And even elders in the family don't seem to be objecting. Probably they want to eat the cake as fast as possible. So they say, fine, fine, they'll clap and then they'll blow off those candles and be happy. But like if Americans or people in England blow off a candle, their culture does not associate this blowing off with something inauspicious happening. But in our culture, we do. Why don't we bother about it? Why doesn't somebody tell someone not to do it? I am perplexed. I am not happy with the answer saying that the Britishers brought this custom to India. Oh, Britishers brought so many customs to India. Are we following all of them? Do our women go around on the beaches in bikinis? You go to Indian beaches, and very few Indian women would be going around in bikinis. That's also a foreign practice which was brought to India. So this answer is not sufficient. That we copied this custom from the Britishers who ruled India is also not sufficient. Why did you copy something which was so against your own culture? The third thing is even more surprising. Most of us, I'm sure 100% of us who are attending this webinar must be using this expression called touch wood to protect your good fortune. You get a lottery prize and then you say touch wood, or you clear an examination and you say touch wood. I hope there's nothing administratively wrong and the results which have been published are really right. I don't want them to be changed. I don't want them to change for any reason. I want to protect my good fortune. So touch wood. Why not touch metal? Why not touch water? Why only touch wood? I'm giving you a few seconds to turn around that question in your mind before telling you the answer, that it's actually a Christian custom. I mean, nothing wrong in any religious customs. But I'm insisting that in case you want to follow that system, understand it. And then follow it. I have nothing against following it. I have been educated in a Christian missionary school. And I found that those brothers, sisters, and fathers, they themselves did not know the meaning of touch wood, at least the implication of the term touch wood. The wood in the expression touch wood refers to the wooden cross on which Jesus Christ was crucified. And hence for Christianity, wood is holier than everything else. And by saying touch wood, they are actually praying to Jesus to protect their good fortune. That's what it really means. But I see hundreds of those missionaries going around with metal crosses. And whenever I talk to them, they are equally perplexed as others that this is really what touch wood means. Okay, I'm coming to question 4. I must rush a little bit. Many of you must be students of science and engineering here. When we get an electric shock, for example, our finger or a hand sometimes touches a naked wire or whatever. Why does our hand get stuck to that source of electric current? This is a very common phenomena. I'm sure all of us have gone through it at least once or twice. It could be serious, but we've surely seen a hand getting stuck to a source of electric current. Now there's no glue on our hands. Why does it still get stuck? I mean, even after going through that experience, the question does not come to anybody's mind, basically because answering that question probably does not give them an increase in their monthly salary, or does not give them more money or whatever. I mean, it gives them no benefits. So they have completely ignored trying to seek an answer to questions like these. And this is precisely I'm trying to emphasize, which is required to develop scientific temper. The answer is simple. There is no glue on the fingertips of ours. What happens is that when our hand touches the source of electric current, the current flows in our body, which is what we say is getting a shock. Now, how does the brain communicate to all the organs? The brain actually wants to send a signal to the tip of your finger saying that please withdraw your hand, otherwise it is damaging your body. The brain sends all these signals through minute electric currents, microamperes, maybe even less. But this current which is taking that instruction to the tip of that finger to withdraw the hand does not reach that tip of the finger because a much larger current is flowing already in the hand in the opposite direction. So the hand remains stuck not because of glue, but because of the instruction from the brain not reaching the fingertip. I'll give you a small parallel example. When your hand touches a hot object, this does not happen. It is not as if the hand remains stuck to the hot, maybe tawa in your kitchen or whatever. The brain immediately asks the tip of the finger to withdraw the hand, and it does it. But in the case of electricity, this command from the brain does not reach the tip of the finger. And that's why it appears to remain stuck. I think that should be sufficient for me to demonstrate that if you do not find it very interesting to keep answering such questions just because they do not bring you any benefits, then I guess that's 1 point down for you in terms of developing scientific temper. So let me switch to strategy number 2. Strategy number 2 is that believe in only those conclusions that are statistically valid. Now, don't get afraid by this word statistics. Don't say I'm not a student of mathematics. How do I understand what is statistical validity? I'm going to explain it to you in 15 seconds. Without your being a student of statistics. In a large enough sample size, if a certain event keeps on happening more than 50% of the times, then that conclusion is statistically valid. The sample size, of course, has to be of a sufficient volume. You can't study an event only twice and come to a conclusion. And statistics or any of the mathematicians will tell you, if you explain to them your problem, about how many samples are required in order to have the conclusion statistically valid. Please don't get into this, don't get the impression that everything is 100% statistically valid, that all scientific subjects are 100% statistically valid. It's not so. Physics, chemistry, mathematics, yes. But you go to the other side, you have psychology, you have sociology, you have political science, you have medicine, where conclusions do not have 100% validity. Psychology, for example, is considered to be a good science. Many conclusions have a statistical validity of just 60 to 70%, but we still call it a science. So the crucial figure is 50%. In a large enough sample size, if whatever is happening happens persistently for more than 50% of the times, then you say that this is statistically valid, irrespective of whether you are able to explain why it is happening or not. When you can't explain an event, we call that as an empirical conclusion. But let's not get into that. So empirical theories and empirical hypotheses are perfectly valid until the time that you finally get to know why it was happening the way it was happening. While on this statistical validity business, I'd like to mention two things. Many of us believe that some moments in a day and some days in a year are auspicious. Now, no moment or no day is auspicious. Every moment is auspicious, every day is auspicious. I'm sure many of us got married at something like 9:37. I mean, because that was the muhurtam at which we were supposed to get married, to live a happy and married life. Please ask yourself whether that 9:37 worked or not. You still fight with your wives, don't you? Or with your spouses? But in spite of not getting a statistical validity of this particular event, you will still go and marry your sons and daughters at 8:26. I mean, I don't know why. The hypothesis was not proved, but you still wanted to follow it. And that would be then one step down for, what I am calling a scientific temper. My proposition, of course, is that there is no auspicious moment and there is no auspicious day. Or rather, there is no inauspicious moment and there is no inauspicious day. Let me, in the next 2-3 minutes, quote to you the excellent studies done by Professor Jayant Nararikar, who stays in Pune, who's been decorated with a Padma Vibhushan, and who is an astrophysicist of great repute. He wanted to test whether astrology gives statistically valid predictions or not. So he conducted a very simple experiment. He collected 100 horoscopes. He did not tell whose horoscope they were. Of course, he knew it. He made an appeal to all kinds of astrologers saying that please come and take the Xerox copies of these 100 horoscopes. Use whatever technique you want to use and give answers to 3 questions. He asked only 3 questions and there was no personal bias or any kind of a bias of that kind. You will see, I'll tell you the questions. The first question he wanted them to answer was, is this guy a male or a female? There's no bias. Second was, is this guy married or unmarried? And the third question was, is he alive or dead? So take these Xeroxes of 100 horoscopes, use whatever techniques you want, and in a week's time, please give me the answers to these 3 questions. About 60 astrologers approached him, took over those 100 horoscope copies and gave him back the results. Now, he did not compare results astrologer by astrologer. He analyzed them totally. Now, see, there were 60 astrologers who took the horoscopes. There were 100 horoscopes and there were 3 questions. So 60 into 100 into 3. He got a total of 18,000 answers. And this was considered to be a good enough sample size. He has conducted this test thrice in the last 10 years. The last time that he conducted it was just about, I think, 2 years ago, and a well-documented study was done by him. Amongst the 18,000 results that he got, the success rate, because he knew the correct answers to all these 3 questions for each horoscope, the success rate was less than 25%. And he said, this is the 3rd time that it is happening. And the success rate is below, definitely below, much below 50%. So he said, how can we consider astrology as a science? It is not generating testable predictions and it's not giving statistically valid conclusions. There was one more question I just wanted to ask you for you to think about it. No, astrology claims that they can, with a reasonable accuracy, not the moment, but at least the month in which a person is going to die. I mean, at least they claim. So let's give it to them. Now, I would like to ask you a question that before selling a life insurance policy, is there any company in the world, I'm not talking of India or USA, any company in the world who consults the horoscope of the guy to whom that policy is being sold? Otherwise, it means tremendous losses to that life insurance company. If the guy buys the policy, pays 1 or 2 premiums and then dies, it's a huge loss. And in order to protect their losses, companies and people will go to a great extent irrespective of their beliefs. So I leave it to you whether you need to still follow the conclusions that astrology gives us, but things are a little dicey. I would urge you to ensure that please believe only in those conclusions which are statistically validated. Okay, let's go to strategy number 3. I must hurry up a little bit. Strategy number 3 is my appeal to you that if you want to develop scientific temper, you need to oppose public obstinacy. What is public obstinacy? I've been reading about vaccine hesitancy in the USA. I think this is public obstinacy. Some people, for some reasons known only to them and their communities, would not take the vaccine and would not explain to us why they are not taking the vaccine. They're just being obstinate. In India, we have a huge number of people opposing sex education in schools. Why? Because they think the sex education in schools will probably spoil the morals of their children. They don't know that the television shows and the books and the magazines that are available very freely have already spoiled those children so much that sex education can't do anything further. But no, they will oppose. India as a big and a progressive country has not been able to include sex education in their syllabi of schools, primarily for this reason. A tremendous opposition from different communities about why it should not be done. In my own town, Nagpur, which aspires to be a smart city, it took us at least 10 years to make helmets compulsory for two-wheel riders. Imagine that. The statistics were very clear. The data was very clear that 80% of the deaths that take place in accidents of two-wheelers, that means motorcycles and scooters, happen because of a head injury. And therefore, if helmets are made compulsory, this would reduce substantially. But no, our religion doesn't allow helmets. I mean, all kinds of objections. I'm not going to further explain this particular point. My only request to all of you would be that wherever you see public obstinacy, if you're not able to directly oppose it, because you may not be that kind of a person, or you may not have that kind of a personality, I can understand. But don't do anything which will support this public obstinacy. Opposing public obstinacy is one of the more efficient ways of developing scientific temper, because you are doing things without explaining. You are doing things without explaining it to even yourself. Okay, let's go to strategy number 4. Strategy number 4 is you must believe in this maxim that there are no miracles in this world. I mean, people think that miracles do take place. And obviously, miracles are those events which defy explanation. I mean, if you see a magic show on the stage, I'm sure we cannot explain most of the tricks that the guy is showing us. But even he admits that this is not magic. I mean, it is magic, but this is not something which is going against natural laws. He has his tricks which he's not willing to share with you, which is fine because they are trade secrets. Now imagine this. In Christianity, for example, you require a certified miracle to be witnessed by some people. Certified means witnessed by some observers, unless a person is conferred the sainthood. I mean, they need to submit documentation and the witnesses need to say that, yes, this person did commit these miracles. And then only the Pope sanctions the sainthood. So Mother Teresa in India, who is now Saint Teresa, in her papers which went to the Vatican, the miracles were recorded and there were witnesses which said that we have seen this happening. I mean, miracles, some events appear miraculous. You have an air crash, out of the maybe 300 people, 295 die and 4 or 5 survive. It's indeed a miracle. But it's not a miracle of the type that we think it is. Nobody has made it happen that way. A patient which is given up by doctors recovers. It's not a miracle. It's just that the doctors do not 100% yet know of all the methods of cure. And the body is supposed to be a great healer of itself. So maybe when we find that person recovering after the doctors had given him up, akin to a miracle, I'm not saying that it doesn't appear like a miracle. If you go and see the meaning of the word miracle in an English dictionary, this event will qualify for that. But if you want to increase your scientific temper, I think you need to accept the fact that there are just no miracles. And what look like miracles are events which had an extremely tiny probability of happening, but in spite of that, they happened. And they confounded us. And then we branded them as miracles. There are just no miracles. Okay, I'm coming to my last strategy. From various events, from various things that you might have come across, or at least I have studied, I have found that sometimes religion does not allow you to develop scientific temper. There is a popular conception that religion and science are against each other. Actually, it's not so. Religions do come out with various theorems or happenings or whatever you may call them, which have no explanation and for which those religious people will give you no explanations. They say this has to be taken as a given. So let's not go into that. Let's not go into rituals and superstitions, etc. But let me tell you that if you try and understand your religion through its philosophies rather than its rituals, then I think you are on the right track. Rituals are something, some people will wash their hands before entering the place of worship. Others would wash their feet before entering the place of worship. Some people will worship a tree. Some people will worship. Rituals are endless. And I'm not saying don't do the rituals. They put your mind to rest. They calm you down. All the advantages are there. But I would suggest and strongly urge all of you that if you really want to understand your religion, do it through the philosophies on which it is based. Now, many people have asked me saying it's easier to say this. You come from the Hindu religion. Can you tell us the basic philosophies of Hindu religion? So I said, yes. I am going to remove that apprehension from today. It's not as if I have done this. It's available. So today, just to make matters simple, I'm going to read out the 8 main principles on which Hinduism is based. 8. I'm not claiming that this will explain 100% of Hinduism. It's too old a religion, too wide a religion for it to be paraphrased in 8 principles. But I am urging you to get into this habit. If tomorrow Islam does it, and then Christianity does it, because I don't have enough knowledge of those religions, otherwise I would have attempted to, write down the philosophies on which those two religions are also based. But today, and I think that will be one small step forward, many of you would know this, but I'm only paraphrasing them and putting them in an understandable format. Which are the 8 main principles of Hinduism? Number 1 is rebirth. Hinduism believes that all of us get reborn after our death, and some kind of a reward punishment system operates. We'll not go into greater details. I'm sure all of you know what I mean to say. This is unique. It's different from the philosophies of most other religions. That we get reborn, and this rebirth is in the form which is decided by as a reward and or a punishment for what we did in the previous birth. Number 2, they said the main objective of every Hindu is to get out of this cycle of rebirth, what we call as moksha or salvation. So your purpose is not just to live life, die, then again get reborn, again die. Your objective should always be that I will live my life so well that I get out of this cycle of rebirth. That's what Hinduism says. The third principle of Hinduism is called Advait. Advait means non-duality. Hinduism tells us that the creator and the person who is created are the same thing. They are part of the same entity. So how can you hate another person when he is a part of you? And so is the God a part of you. Now, this is a very, very unique philosophy of Hinduism, not found in any other religion. Advait it's called. The fourth principle is predetermined destiny. Your destiny is written, well written. You can't do much about it, and you've got to live along. The fifth principle of Hinduism is extreme tolerance. I mean, it is a libertarian's delight. It doesn't tell you what dress to wear. It doesn't tell you which god to worship. It doesn't tell you the days on which you should worship them. You could worship, maybe they have assigned a day to a deity, but that doesn't prevent you from worshipping that deity on some other day. It does not, straitjacket a method of worship. It is so libertarian that it even accepts atheists as Hindus. You could be a Gnostic, you could be an atheist, and still Hinduism says you can be a part of us. I'm sure most of you know there is a big part of Hinduism which was formed by Charvaka. And therefore, there is no religion in the world other than Buddhism which accepts the principle that atheists can continue to be in our religion. Buddhism, of course, is a religion which, Buddhism is an atheistic religion itself. But other than that, it is Hinduism which says you can be a Hindu and you can also be an atheist. So that was extreme tolerance that I was talking about. Principle number 6 is Hinduism says you've got to live your life in those 4 ashrams. I mean, excellent marketing segmentation, I would call it. How? You have a brahmacharya ashram, then you have a grahastha ashram, then you have vanaprastha ashram, and then you have a sannyas ashram. I mean, most of us know what these ashrams are, but we probably don't know that there are objectives for each ashram which are unique to that ashram itself. You can't behave like a brahmachari in your grahastha ashram. Things won't work out. You can't behave like a sannyasi in your grahastha ashram. So each of these ashrams are what we go through in our life. These are different stages of life. I find this theory fascinating. And each part of that life of ours, each ashram has a different objective. And we are supposed to follow that objective when we are in that ashram. And then you're supposed, you live a good, happy, well-contented life. That's what Hinduism says. Principle number 7 is, of course, that famous Gita shlok, karmane vadhikarasya ma phaleshu kadachana. which means when you are trying to do a task, don't be completely obsessed with the results. Otherwise, you'll forget the purpose of why you are doing that task. And the last principle or the philosophy of Hinduism is what we say, that God has told us that in case the sins in this world increase, in case the chaos in this world increases, I will take birth as another avatar. Well, these are the 8 principles of Hinduism. Now, what is important is that do you agree and accept these 8 principles? If you ask me, and I saw them carefully, and I possibly accept 3 out of those 8. So the next time I have to fill up a government form where religion is written, I think I'll end up writing 3 by 8 Hindu. Now, there is no provision of writing like that in any government form. That's a different matter. What I am trying to emphasize is that if all of us look at our religion through these basic philosophies, then I think it is a huge step that we will be taking towards developing scientific temper. I'm almost at the end of whatever I wanted to share with you. There are just 3 conclusions that I would like to state in 3 sentences, and we are done. Developing scientific temper is a national task, at least for Indians, because it's mentioned in our constitution. Principle number 2, it is not a fight between science and religion. It's a fight between you and irrationality. Don't you want to win that fight? So with these 2 thoughts in your mind, I'd like to thank all of you for giving me such a patient hearing. I do not insist that you agree with me. In fact, the more you disagree with me, the happier will I be. But I hand it over back to Hiren. In case there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them, Hiren. I am through.
Sure, Prakashji, on behalf of everybody, I am the only one probably being audible at this point. So a big applause to you from everybody. Thank you. And we got about 15 minutes or a little less than 15 minutes left. I will take up some few questions we have and see how briefly we can do that. One came from Krishna Bhavilala. He is from Houston. It is 2 parts: religion, astrology, and superstitions in India. How do you assess their impact on economic progress in India? You want to take that part first, or should I read the part B as well?
Maybe you could read the part B also.
Okay. Part B is, we are all proud of Indian culture, which has survived thousands of years. It is a baggage for India's progress. We all saw Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh put tilak on the French fighter plane Rafale before taking delivery in France. Over to you.
Okay, I'll answer the second one first.
Okay.
Rajnath Singh putting a tilak on Rafale is a harmless superstition. You see, when you start eliminating the superstitions in your personality, eliminate the ones which have the potential of harming others. I mean, by his putting a tilak on the Rafale, he's probably calmed his own mind and probably the minds of maybe thousands of viewers who were also watching that. Putting a tilak in itself is not very harmful. So I think we need to ignore them, because in our fight against superstitions, let's try and remove those superstitions which are more harmful to us. So I think we need to.
Prakashji, can I add on to it?
Yes.
Then a slightly bigger probably task, when ISRO sends their models to Tirupati to bless them, and that way you keep extending things, right?
You see, in the case of Tirupati, I cited that example because highly scientific people are doing it. And we expect highly scientific people not to do it unless they've associated success with this action. For a common person, it's all right. I mean, he's not able to understand. But what about those PhD in missile technology? I'll give you a small example. One of my friends in college or in school, in India, there is a practice of, when you go for your examinations, your mother gives a spoonful of rice, curd and sugar on your hand. I don't know whether I'm sure it's not there in America. And it's supposed to bring you good luck and do your exam well. Curd is supposed to calm you down, but I don't know how that one spoonful of curd is going to calm you down. But still, that practice continues. Now, I have a friend who said that I failed in physics because my mother didn't have curd at home that day. Now, imagine that. I mean, imagine him blaming a funny instance. So that is when I think we need to take that out of his mind. Those are the instances when we should not tolerate those superstitions. Okay, coming back to the first part of the question, what economic impact these superstitions have? There have been some studies conducted. Superstitions may not have a direct impact on the economy, but it has a lot of indirect impact on the economy. It might give second-class status to women. It might give second-class status to some castes or some communities. And as a result of which the progress of the nation will get hampered. Some people may not get good educational facilities as a result of this, or some people may get educational facilities for a far longer time than what is justified. So superstitions usually bring about such kinds of inequalities which further result into loss of, let's say, GDP. Let's put it GDP. But ironically, in many cases, religious practices and superstitions actually increase your GDP. Imagine people due to Vastu Shastra break down their house because their bedroom was facing the wrong direction. Aren't you generating more services in the economy? Some people are getting wages, some cement is getting sold, some bricks are now getting sold. So, according to me, religion generates a tremendous amount of commerce. And commerce is what increases your GDP. Imagine tomorrow if we make a rule that all marriages must be registered marriages. They can't be ritualistic marriages of the type that we normally have. Don't you think that will bring down the economy phenomenally? All those bandwalas and flowerwalas and the religious people who are telling the pujas and the mandapwalas, and I mean, their business would just go down. So in many cases, superstitions and many rituals and practices promoted by religion actually increase the GDP. This is something which we need to realize. So not always do superstitions have a negative effect on the economy.
Okay, thank you. It is a very specific question, and I think we had a good answer here. I have another question from Krishnaji. Before that, I will go to Mr. Alok Chandra. He asked, on Pradakshina example you gave, should we infer that scientific temper is to bring forth a progressive society by making it free from superstitions and irrational practices? Or the practice is more related to mental calmness and strength, which is a key element of science sustainability?
I agree with him. Most of these rituals and religious practices bring about a calm demeanor in your mind, and therefore even psychologists recommend them. My insistence here, even when I was speaking about it, was that do not follow a practice unless you understand it. And if you don't understand it as of now, make efforts to understand it. Because if you follow the practice after understanding it, it will probably bring more calm than what it did when you did it mechanically.
Good answer.
So that is what I would suggest.
Thanks. And we got a few more questions. Here is Pramod Pathak from Nasik, India. How do you define science? Because unless we understand what is science, there can be no clues to developing scientific mind.
I think instead of defining science, you could pay attention to what I said is the method which science applies to the various things that it does. That method which I said, question, then test, then observe, then come out with a hypothesis, then probably come out with testable predictions, and finally come out with a theory. So that is known as the scientific method. So that is science. I mean, for all practical purposes, that is science. So there is no need to separately define science. That would define science in most of its width.
Here is one Mr. Jai Kishan. Prakashji has explained scientific temper in a very simple method using logical example of reality using religion and science. Really appreciate. Okay, this is just an appreciation. Absolutely correct. And now I will go back to one of my question actually. Let's see, how do you already defined destiny as one of the principle. Can you elaborate at least as quickly as possible, because there are a few other questions. How do you elaborate destiny? Because I started believing in destiny because so many things, not so many, at least 5 things happen in my life. Never dreamt of, never planned for it, but it did happen for good, of course, luckily. Can you just talk a little bit about it?
Yes, destiny is a path which has been pre-charted for you in this life. If you want a dictionary definition, that's what it will be.
Okay.
The question is, who charted it for you, and why did you believe that that this was charted for you by someone? If you try to answer these 2 questions, then you will gradually start realizing that what you consider destiny is that event which happened due to circumstances which were outside your control. You probably did not do much in order to make it happen that way, but it did finally happen that way. So not everything that happens in your life is because of something that you do yourself. The environment acts on it. Other people in the family and the community and everything acts on it. So it's a very complex process as to why a certain event in your life happens the way it does. So it's normal human tendency that whatever we cannot understand, we attribute it to destiny. So destiny is just a word in that case.
Okay. We don't have time probably very much right now. I will expand on that a little bit. I mean, separately, if there is time permits. Another question is, if time is neutral, there is no good time, bad time, right? Or month or year. How do you say about Brahma Muhurtam? That everything is good if you get up at 4:30 and 5:30, and it helps you self-realization if you put on reflection. So that question is bugging quite a lot.
No, the Brahma Muhurtam at 4:30 in the morning is considered good because you've just got up from sleep and your mind is fresh.
Okay.
So I guess it's because of that the Muhurtam is considered to be good, not because there is inherently something auspicious in that hour.
I see. Okay. I understand that. Somebody, a Zoom user, we didn't understand the 4 stages that you noted under the 6th principle. Can he repeat them?
Yes, they are very popularly, mentioned in many texts and philosophical texts of Hinduism. One is Brahmacharya Ashram, Brahmacharya Ashram. That means that phase of life when you are a Brahmachari. Then we enter Grahastha Ashram. When you raise a family, you marry, you procreate. These are 4 stages of life. The 3rd stage of life is Vanaprastha Ashram. That means where you start thinking that, how do I now retire? What do I do after retirement? literally the word Vanaprasthanashram means Vana is jungle, and you don't have to really proceed towards the jungle. But this is a mental state whereby you say that I need to now get out of all these daily activities that I have been doing for so many years, and I must now contemplate my retirement. And finally, sannyasashram, where you, when you get yourself detached from all material things in life.
If I can have a follow-up on this, to be real happy in life, I think one has to learn detachment from childhood, like when you were maybe 15-year-old or before 20-year-old. To understand really life, detachment needs to be understood a little early enough rather than waiting for retirement. By the time it is too late, you have gone through all the joys and miseries of life in the whole span. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. All right. Can I go back to a question from Krishnaji earlier? Yeah, his question was basically, can religion, it seems science and, yeah, he feels that science and superstitions can coexist. Any reaction?
What he says is true, because things which were superstitions 15 years ago are no longer superstitions now. They were superstitions then because people did not know why they were happening the way they were happening. So they were put into certain practices were prescribed, and without the knowledge as to why these practices are being followed, those practices were imposed upon people. So in those times, those were superstitions. But as soon as we came to know, let me give you an example. Take this science of meditation. How did our rishis and sannyasis find out about meditation without knowing much about the human physiology or about the human brain? But they had hit on the right track that a meditation does calm the mind. It does remove many physiological maladies. But at that time, many people must have thought this is a superstition. You're closing your eyes and going into a dhyan. And, today it has been proved that it helps to calm down your mind and body, both. So superstitions don't remain superstitions across decades. Some of them, of course, die down because they are real superstitions. They have no benefit in them.
Okay, thank you. There is another question from Vidyasagar. Why Ganesha is prayed for doing anything first by Hindus?
Well, that's because that's what is written in our texts. So we have followed that. Frankly, nobody would be able to give an answer to that unless you believe everything that is written in our mythological texts. For example, it is difficult to find out why Ganesha likes modaks and why not maybe bundi ka laddu. It is very difficult. I mean, if you ask that question to somebody as to why do you always chadhav a bhog of modaks to Ganesha. So similarly, why is Ganesh worshipped first is an inexplicable answer. It's a ritual which has got established, which apparently has some stories backing it. But none of those stories will stand the scrutiny of either history or logic.
Okay. One last question. It's more of a broad question. How do you define a religion, or what is religion? That's a big question.
That's a big question, but let me just give you 2 or 3 aspects of religion. Religion is basically a science of man management. They were all designed to manage communities, large communities, which are difficult to manage singly or individually. So you make a rule for the entire community and expect everyone to follow it. And then you have a reward and punishment system whereby if you don't follow it, then you're thrown out of the community. So it started off like a social system. And then all kinds of things came into it about about divinity and things like that, where people were, these things were invented, according to me, to keep the flock together. So I think in the short time
Okay.
available, I'll be able to give you only these two aspects of religion. But it being a man management science is, to my mind, the best.
Makes sense. I think I have run out of questions. And so we really appreciate everybody sticking to the end, asking good questions. Wish more people could have joined in future. We'll do a better campaign probably. And thank you everybody from participants, FIS, and absolutely for Mr. Prakash says for this enlightening session and good discussions. Thank you everybody. Those in India, good night. And those in USA, have a good day.
Right.
Okay, bye.